The air in Ashford, 1858, was thick with a chill that cut deeper than any winter wind. It was the kind of cold that seemed to settle in your bones and whisper secrets of the earth. For Elias Thorne, a traveling journalist with a hunger for the truth and a past he couldn't outrun, the town was nothing more than a temporary respite. His assignment was a simple one: document the quiet lives of a rural community for a Boston newspaper. But the moment his carriage rattled to a stop outside the Ashwood Inn, he felt the first stirrings of an unease that had nothing to do with the journey's fatigue. The inn was a two-story structure of weathered timber, its windows like vacant eyes staring out at the desolate landscape. A sign, worn and faded, creaked on its hinges. The Ashwood Inn, Mr. Alistair Finch, proprietor. The building itself seemed to slouch under the weight of its own history. The sky, a bruised purple, bled into the horizon as the last light of day vanished. Elias, a man in his late 30s, with a face etched with lines of worry, disembarked. He was a figure of modest means, his suit of worn tweed and his leather satchel a stark contrast to the opulence of the big city journalists. He had the sharp eyes of a hawk and a mind that constantly sifted through details, a habit that had both served him well and led him into trouble. Inside, the inn was bathed in the warm, yet eerie glow of a single fireplace. The scent of damp wood and forgotten dust hung in the air, a musty perfume that made Elias's nose wrinkle. Behind a mahogany counter stood Mr. Alistair Finch, the proprietor. He was a wiry man with a gaunt face and hands that seemed too large for his frame. His eyes, dark and sunken, held a vacant stare that made Elias feel as if he were being measured, not welcomed. A room for the night? The Finch's voice was a low, raspy whisper, like dry leaves skittering across a cobblestone street. Just one, Elias replied, his voice firm, despite the apprehension that was starting to coil in his stomach. For myself. Finch's gaze lingered for a moment, an unsettling stillness in his dark eyes, before he slid a large, heavy ledger across the counter. The pages were yellowed and brittle, filled with elegant, sloping script. Elias's eyes scanned the entries, a journalist's instinct for detail kicking in. The names were all female: Eleanor, Genevieve, Rose, Clara. A single odd detail caught his attention. Next to each name was a small, crudely drawn illustration of a human hand. "That will be 1 shilling, Finch said, his voice breaking Elias's concentration. Elias placed the coin on the counter, his mind still fixated on the peculiar drawings. "What's with the illustrations?" he asked, trying to sound casual. Finch's gaze flickered to the ledger, then back to Elias. A faint, almost imperceptible smile touched his lips. "A small quirk of mine, Mr. Thorne. I find it helps me remember my guests." The explanation was as thin as tissue paper, but Finch's demeanor offered no room for further questioning. Elias was given a key to room 7, on the 2nd floor. The staircase groaned under his weight, each step a protest against the intrusion. The hallway was a long, dark corridor lined with doors. The air grew colder here, the silence punctuated by the distant moan of the wind and the rhythmic creak of the floorboards. He unlocked the door to his room and stepped inside. The room was sparse, a simple bed and a single chair the only furnishings. A small, grimy window looked out over the inn's courtyard. As he set his satchel down, he noticed something. Tucked beneath the chair, barely visible in the dim light, was a woman's embroidered handkerchief. He picked it up. It was pristine white, save for a small, dark stain in the center, a stain that looked suspiciously like dried blood. A shiver of genuine fear ran down his spine. His journalistic instincts, honed by years of uncovering hidden truths, told him this was not a coincidence. This was a sign. The silence of the inn now felt heavy, suffocating. He thought of the ledger, the list of women's names, and the chilling illustrations. A story, a truly macabre one, was unfolding right before his eyes. He had to decide if he was a journalist, simply observing, or a part of the horror itself. The distant sound of Alistair Finch humming a tune downstairs sent a cold wave of terror through him. It was a simple, innocent melody, yet in the oppressive stillness, it sounded like a funeral dirge. The stain on the handkerchief seemed to pulse in the gloom, a silent accusation. Elias knew, with a certainty that left him breathless, that his simple assignment had just become a terrifying descent into the darkest corners of human depravity. Stay tuned for the next chapter. If you're enjoying this story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more spine-chilling tales. The bloody handkerchief burned a hole in Elias's palm. He couldn't shake the image of the crude drawings in the ledger, the way Alistair Finch's eyes had held a cold, predatory stillness. The bloodstain was small, but undeniable, a silent scream in the desolate room. Elias folded the cloth carefully and tucked it into his breast pocket. He had to think, to verify, to find a logical explanation before jumping to the worst possible conclusion. He left his room and descended the creaking stairs. The scent of cooking, a heavy aroma of boiled cabbage and something else, something metallic and gamey, filled the air. Finch was nowhere in sight. A lone woman, a serving girl with wide, frightened eyes, was wiping down a table in the corner. Her name, he'd later learn, was Sarah. Elias approached her, his voice low and calm. "Pardon me," he said. "I'm a journalist. I was hoping to learn a little about the history of the Ashford Inn." Sarah flinched, her rag pausing in mid-stroke. She glanced toward the kitchen door as if fearing Finch's sudden appearance. "It's a quiet place," she stammered, her voice barely a whisper. "I noticed the ledger," Elias pressed, his gaze steady. "It seems to have a lot of female guests. Do many women travel alone through these parts?" Sarah's eyes darted around the room before settling on Elias's. There was a desperate plea in them. "Some do," she said, her voice dropping even lower. "But they don't stay long." "What happens to them?" Elias asked, the question hanging in the air like a pall. The girl's hands began to tremble. He says they move on to Boston, to seek their fortunes." She swallowed hard. "But I haven't seen a single one leave, not in months." The pieces of the puzzle began to click into place, forming a horrifying picture. The list of women, the drawings, the blood-stained handkerchief, the serving girl's fear. The truth, or at least a grim possibility of it, was beginning to crystallize. "Has anyone reported them missing?" Elias asked. "No one knows they were ever here," Sarah whispered, tears welling in her eyes. "He keeps to himself, and the town is a good distance away. Travelers come and go. No one asks questions." She wrung her hands. "Please, sir, you need to leave. He has a temper and he's always watching." Elias thanked her and retreated to his room. He locked the door and pressed his ear against it, listening. Nothing. Only the creak of the inn and the mournful cry of the wind outside. He knew he couldn't leave now, not with the truth so close. His journalistic duty and a gnawing sense of moral outrage wouldn't allow it. He spent the rest of the night poring over a detailed map of the area, a map he had acquired in Boston. The Ashford Inn was situated on a remote, seldom-traveled road, a perfect place for a man to operate with impunity. The nearest constable was a day's ride away. If he was going to act, he had to do it alone, and he had to be smart. The next morning, Elias made his way to the kitchen, feigning an interest in the local cuisine. Finch was there, his back to him, stirring a pot. The smell of the stew was overpowering, and Elias's stomach turned. "Morning, Mr. Thorne," Finch said, his voice unnervingly calm. "Sleep well?" "Very well, thank you," Elias lied. He peered into the pot. "What are you cooking?" Finch chuckled, a dry, humorless sound. "A little of this, a little of that. A special recipe of mine." He stirred the contents, a dark, viscous mixture. "The secret is to use fresh ingredients," His eyes met Elias's for a fleeting second, and a cold dread washed over him. He wasn't talking about vegetables. Elias excused himself and went outside, the cold air a welcome relief. He saw a small rusted shed at the back of the property. A low-hanging padlock secured the door. He felt a desperate urge to get inside, to find a clue, to confirm his worst fears. He circled the building, noticing a faint sweetish odor, a scent of decay that clung to the damp earth. That afternoon, Elias decided to act. He had to get inside that shed. But how? He was a writer, not a strong man. He returned to the inn, his mind racing. He needed a distraction, something to get Finch away from the property. He would have to create one himself. A plan, reckless and desperate, began to form in his mind. He would pretend to be a lost traveler, someone with a broken-down carriage, someone who needed Finch's help. It was a flimsy idea, but he had no other options. As he walked past the counter, he saw the ledger again. He couldn't resist. He picked it up and flipped through the pages. The drawings were all the same, a hand with a finger or two missing or with a finger crossed out. His blood ran cold. He had been so focused on the hands, he hadn't noticed the details. Finch was not just drawing hands, he was marking which fingers he had taken. "Looking for something, Mr. Thorne?" Finch's voice came from behind him, smooth as silk, yet laced with an undercurrent of threat. Elias's heart hammered against his ribs. He turned slowly, the ledger still in his hands. He was caught. Alistair Finch's face was a mask of polite menace. His lips were curved in a thin, cold smile, but his eyes were black pits of pure malice. He didn't move, yet his presence seemed to fill the room, a suffocating force that pressed in on Elias. The silence stretched, a taut wire ready to snap. Elias knew he had to play his part perfectly. He held up the ledger, feigning casual curiosity. "Just admiring your handwriting, Mr. Finch. It's quite elegant." He forced a laugh that sounded hollow even to his own ears. "And the drawings, quite unique." Finch's smile widened, revealing a set of uneven, yellowed teeth. "A man must have his hobbies, Mr. Thorne. It's what keeps the mind sharp." He took the ledger, his fingers brushing against Elias's. His skin was cold, clammy, like a dead thing. "I trust you find your stay agreeable." "Indeed," Elias said, his voice steady. "But I'm afraid my business in Ashford is finished. I'll be departing in the morning." He had to give Finch a reason to let his guard down, to believe he was no longer a threat. He would not be leaving, of course. Not until he had the proof he needed. Finch's gaze was unsettlingly shrewd. He seemed to see right through Elias's lie. "As you wish. The road to Boston is long and treacherous. Best be on your way early." The words were a subtle warning, a promise of what would happen if he lingered. That night, Elias couldn't sleep. The floorboards above him creaked, and he imagined the footsteps of Alistair Finch, his ghoulish shadow flitting through the halls. He felt like a mouse in a trap, and Finch was the predator, toying with his prey before the final brutal act. He decided to explore the inn more thoroughly. He slipped out of his room, the key turning with a loud click that made him wince. The hallway was a long, dark abyss. He moved like a ghost, his hand trailing along the damp, peeling wallpaper. He found a small locked door at the end of the hall. It was a storage room, he guessed. He pressed his ear against the wood, hearing nothing but a faint, humming sound, like a swarm of angry bees. He returned to his room, his mind reeling. He needed to find a way to get a look at Finch's shed. It was the key to everything. The next morning he put his plan into action. He approached Finch at the counter, a look of contrived distress on his face. "Mr. Finch, I seem to have a problem. My carriage has a broken wheel. The axle, I think." Finch's eyes narrowed. "A broken axle is a serious matter, Mr. Thorne. It will take a good deal of work to fix." "I was hoping you might have some tools," Elias said, his voice full of hope. "Perhaps a hammer and some nails? I'm not much of a carpenter, but I'm willing to try. Finch studied him for a long moment, a strange calculation in his eyes. I have tools, yes, but they are not for loaning out. Elias's heart sank. His plan had failed. He was at a dead end. But then Finch's expression shifted. A slow, chilling smile spread across his face. Tell you what, I will help you, but first, you must help me. I have some things that need to be moved to the shed. Elias's stomach clenched. This was it. Finch was luring him into a trap, but it was also his only chance to get a look at the shed. He had to take the risk. Of course, he said, his voice betraying none of the fear he felt. Whatever you need. They went to the back of the inn. Finch gestured to a large tarp-covered bundle leaning against the wall. This needs to go in the shed. I trust you're a strong man. Elias nodded. He gripped one end of the bundle. It was heavy, and a strange, cold numbness seeped through the thick canvas. He and Finch carried the bundle to the shed. As Finch fumbled with the key, Elias discreetly pulled back a corner of the tarp. He saw it then. The unmistakable shape of a human hand, pale and lifeless, its fingers curled into a grotesque claw. Elias let go of the bundle as if it were a hot coal. He took a stumbling step back, the blood draining from his face. Finch didn't even look up. He was already fumbling with the padlock. Elias turned and ran, his boots pounding against the frozen earth. He didn't look back. He ran until he was out of breath, until his lungs ached and his legs burned. He found himself at the edge of the woods, a small cemetery. The tombstones were old and weathered, the names long since forgotten. But one was new, a simple wooden cross with no name, just the word, Jane. Elias looked at the small, unmarked grave, and a horrible realization dawned on him. Finch wasn't just killing women. He was burying them right here, in a desolate, forgotten cemetery, a stone's throw from his own inn. He had to get help. He couldn't do this alone. But who would believe him? A traveling journalist with a tale of a mad innkeeper who collected human hands. He knew he had to get to the nearest town, to the authorities. He had to expose Finch. But as he turned to leave, he saw a figure standing in the shadows, a silent silhouette against the dying light. It was Alistair Finch. He was holding something small and dark in his hand, something that glittered in the gloom. Elias knew what it was. It was his key, the key to his room, the key he had dropped in his panicked flight. He was trapped. The glint of the key in Alistair Finch's hand was a death sentence. He stood silent and unmoving at the edge of the woods, a predatory silhouette in the fading twilight. Elias's heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic drumbeat of pure terror. He was caught, exposed, and alone. Looking for something, Mr. Thorne? Finch's voice was a low, sibilant whisper. He took a slow, deliberate step forward, the dry leaves crunching under his boots. It's not wise to wander off. Elias took a step back, his eyes darting from Finch to the empty road. There was nowhere to run. Finch was a spider, and he had just blundered into the center of his web. He knew he couldn't fight him, not in a direct confrontation. He was a journalist, not a brawler. He had to use his mind to outwit the man. I was just admiring the scenery, Elias said, his voice trembling slightly despite his best efforts to keep it steady. Finch chuckled, a dry, rattling sound. The scenery around here is quite scenic, don't you think? He held up the key. You dropped this. Careless of you. He took another step forward, closing the distance between them. It's dangerous to be careless in a place like this. Elias knew he had to feign innocence. Thank you, he said, holding out his hand. I appreciate you finding it. Finch's hand closed around the key, his grip tightening. He didn't release it. It's a peculiar little place, Ashford. People come and go. No one asks questions. It's peaceful. He smiled, and the look was purely malevolent. I prefer it that way. Elias's mind raced. He had to get away to warn someone, but Finch had him cornered. He saw the shovel leaning against a nearby tree, the same shovel he had used to dig a grave for his victims. A cold, hard knot of fear solidified in Elias's stomach. Suddenly, a voice rang out from the road. "Mr. Finch, are you there? I need your help." Finch's head snapped around, his attention diverted for a split second. It was Sarah, the serving girl. She was standing at the edge of the woods, a lantern in her hand, her face a mask of terror. She had seen him. She knew what he was. She had come to warn him. "What do you want, girl?" Finch's voice was a low snarl. The fire, sir," Sarah stammered, her voice high with fear. "It's gone out. I can't get it to light." Finch hesitated for a moment, a flicker of suspicion in his eyes. He looked from Sarah to Elias, a silent calculation. The fire was his livelihood, his source of warmth. He had no choice but to go. He shot a final, menacing look at Elias before turning and walking back toward the inn. "I'll be back," he said, the words a silent promise. "Don't go anywhere, Mr. Thorne." Elias watched him go, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm. He was safe, for now. He turned to Sarah, who was trembling, her face pale. "You saved my life," he said, his voice full of gratitude. "You need to leave," she whispered, her eyes wide with fear. He knows you're not just a traveler." "I can't," Elias said, shaking his head. "I have to get to the authorities. We have to stop him." Sarah's eyes filled with tears. "You don't understand. He's everywhere. He sees everything. There's no escaping him." Elias looked at her, seeing the raw, palpable fear in her eyes. It was the same fear he had seen in the eyes of his past subjects, the same fear he had tried to ignore. He took her arm gently. "We will go together," he said, his voice a low, calming murmur. "We will get to the constable. We will expose him. We will be safe." Sarah was hesitant, but the conviction in Elias's voice was a beacon of hope in the suffocating darkness of her life. She nodded slowly. "Okay," she said, her voice barely audible. "Okay." They agreed to meet at the edge of the woods, away from the inn, in 2 hours. Elias went back to his room, his mind racing. He had to gather his things, the ledger, the handkerchief, the evidence. He had to be quick, to be silent. He packed his satchel, his hands shaking. He felt like he was walking on a razor's edge. As he was about to leave his room, he heard a sound from the other side of the wall. A low, muffled sobbing. It was coming from the room next to his, room 8. Elias froze. He thought the inn was empty. He had seen no other guests. His journalistic curiosity, so often a curse, was now a driving force. He crept to the wall and pressed his ear against it. The sobbing was faint, but unmistakable. Someone was in that room, and they were in distress. He felt a new wave of adrenaline, a new sense of purpose. He couldn't just leave. There was someone else here. Someone else who was in danger. He had to find a way to get into that room. He looked at his satchel, then at the wall. He had a choice to make. He could run, or he could try to save an unknown victim, a victim he couldn't even see. He knew what he had to do. He couldn't abandon her. He had to find a way to get her out. He heard the heavy footsteps of Alistair Finch on the stairs. He was coming back. Time was running out. The rhythmic thud of Alistair Finch's boots on the stairs was a drumbeat of impending doom. Elias's heart pounded in sync with the sound, a frantic, terrified rhythm. He had to act fast. He couldn't just leave, not with a potential victim so close. The muffled sobs from room 8 were a silent plea, a desperate cry for help he couldn't ignore. He looked at the door to his own room, then at the wall separating him from the unknown victim. He had no tools, no way to break down the door. He had to think of another way. He looked around the room, his eyes darting from one object to another. A simple metal chair. A heavy wooden bed frame. Nothing that could break through a thick wooden door. The footsteps were closer now, just outside his room. Elias held his breath, his body rigid with fear. He heard a faint scratching sound, then a soft click, the key turning in the lock. Finch was trying to get in. Elias backed away from the door, his hand instinctively going to the small rusted letter opener he carried in his satchel. It was a pathetic weapon, but it was all he had. The door creaked open, and Alistair Finch stepped inside. His eyes, black and malevolent, were fixed on Elias. He held Elias's room key in his hand, a mocking, triumphant smile on his face. "I told you not to wander off, Mr. Thorne," Finch said, his voice a low, chilling purr. "I'm a man of my word." Elias knew he had to stall. He had to buy time. "Mr. Finch, I believe there's been a misunderstanding." "Oh, I don't think so," Finch said, his smile widening. He took a step into the room, his hand reaching for the satchel on the bed. "A journalist, you say?" With a curious eye. "I'm afraid that kind of curiosity can be dangerous." Elias lunged, his hand outstretched, not at Finch but at the window. He smashed it open with the heel of his hand, glass shattering on the floor. He didn't care about the noise, the attention. He just needed to create a diversion. Finch flinched, his attention momentarily diverted. Elias didn't hesitate. He swung the satchel at Finch's face. Finch was fast, his reflexes sharp. He ducked, but the heavy satchel caught him on the side of the head. He staggered back, a low growl escaping his lips. Elias used the opportunity to run, to sprint out of the room and into the hallway. He didn't look back. He ran to room 8, the sobs from inside now a frantic, desperate wail. He rattled the doorknob, but it was locked. He heard Finch's footsteps behind him, coming closer. He was trapped. He looked at the door, then at the wall, then back at the door. He had to get in. He had to save her. He had an idea. It was crazy, reckless, and it just might work. He took a running start and slammed his shoulder against the door. The old wood groaned but held. He did it again, and again. The door began to splinter around the lock. "What are you doing?" Finch's voice was a low snarl from behind him. "You're a dead man, Thorne." Elias ignored him. He slammed his shoulder against the door one last time. With a loud crack, the lock broke, and the door swung open. He stumbled into the room, breathing hard. He was in a small, dark closet. A woman was huddled in the corner, her body shaking with sobs. Her hands were bound behind her back. "Don't be afraid," Elias said, his voice a whisper. "I'm a journalist. I'm here to help you." He knelt down, his fingers fumbling with the rough twine. It was knotted tight. He could hear Finch's heavy breathing right outside the door. He was in the hallway, watching. "Who is she?" Finch's voice was a cold, chilling purr. "A new friend. I'm afraid you won't be able to stay." Elias ignored him. He pulled the small letter opener from his pocket and began to saw at the twine. It was slow, agonizing work. The sobs of the woman next to him were now a frantic, terrified gasping. "Her name is Sarah," Finch said, and a terrible realization dawned on Elias. The girl he had spoken to earlier, the one who had saved his life. She was here, in this closet, and Finch knew. He had lied to him. He had lured him in. He saw the flicker of a match. Finch was holding a lantern, a chillingly calm expression on his face. He was not going to kill them with a knife or a gun. He was going to burn them alive. The light from the lantern filled the small, suffocating space. Elias saw Sarah's face, her eyes wide with terror, her mouth gagged with a cloth, and he saw something else. On the floor, next to her, was a small, crudely drawn illustration of a human hand. A hand with a missing finger. The realization hit Elias like a punch to the gut. The drawings in the ledger, the list of women. Finch wasn't killing them for money. He was collecting them. Their hands, their fingers. He was a deranged, macabre collector. He finished cutting the twine. Sarah's hands were free. She ripped the gag from her mouth and screamed. It was a primal, gut-wrenching scream of pure terror. "Run!" Elias shouted, pushing her toward the door. "Get out of here!" She didn't hesitate. She scrambled to her feet and ran out of the room, past Finch, toward the stairs. Finch just stood there, watching her go, a small, triumphant smile on his face. "Go on, little bird," he whispered. "You can't escape the cage for long." Elias, for a moment, was confused. Why didn't he stop her? Why was he letting her go? He looked at Finch, then at the lantern in his hand. Finch didn't want to kill them. He wanted to torture them. He wanted to watch them run, to see their fear, to prolong the game. He was a sadist. Elias had to get out. He had to warn the authorities. But he couldn't leave Sarah. He had to find her. He had to make sure she was safe. He turned and ran out of the room, past Finch, toward the stairs. He heard Finch's laughter behind him, a high, chilling sound that echoed through the empty inn. Elias's boots pounded against the creaking stairs, a frantic rhythm that echoed the terror in his heart. He had to find Sarah, to ensure she was safe, to make sure she was not just a pawn in Finch's twisted game. He burst through the front door and into the frigid night. The air was a sharp, bitter cold that cut through his thin coat. A fresh layer of snow had fallen, a pristine white blanket that stretched out into the darkness. He saw her then, a small, dark figure running toward the woods, her dress a pale blur against the stark white of the snow. He called her name. "Sarah, wait for me!" She didn't slow down. She ran with the wild desperation of a cornered animal, a silent scream of terror. Elias followed, his feet sinking into the fresh snow, his lungs burning with the effort. He saw her disappear into the blackness of the trees, a ghostly shadow swallowed by the night. He reached the edge of the woods and stopped. The trees were like skeletal fingers reaching for the sky, their branches a dense, impenetrable web. The path was gone, swallowed by the snow. He had to make a choice, go in after her, or risk leaving her to Finch's mercy. He knew he had to go in. He plunged into the woods, the silence of the forest a heavy, suffocating weight. The trees were old and gnarled, their branches tangled and menacing. He couldn't see a thing. The moon was hidden behind a thick blanket of clouds, and the only light came from the faint glow of the snow on the ground. He called her name again, his voice swallowed by the vast, empty space. "Sarah, where are you?" He heard a sound then, a small rustle in the bushes. He froze, his heart in his throat. Was it Sarah? Or was it Finch? He stood still, listening, his body rigid with fear. The sound came again, closer this time. It was a footstep, the soft crunch of a boot on a patch of dead leaves. It was not a woman's footstep. Elias took a step back, his hand instinctively going to the letter opener in his pocket. He was a journalist, not a fighter. But he was not going to go down without a fight. He peered into the darkness, his eyes straining to make out a shape, a silhouette. A voice came from the darkness, a low, menacing whisper. "Thought you could escape, Mr. Thorne?" It was Finch. Elias's blood ran cold. He had not gone after Sarah. He had gone after him. He was playing a different game, a more terrifying one. He was hunting him. Elias turned and ran, not back toward the inn, but deeper into the woods. He had to get away, to find a way to the nearest town. He ran blindly, crashing through branches, stumbling over roots. The sound of Finch's footsteps was right behind him, a relentless pursuit. He tripped and fell, his face hitting the hard, frozen earth. He scrambled to his feet, his mind racing. He was trapped. He was going to die here, in this desolate, forgotten forest. Suddenly, a voice, a soft, urgent whisper came from the darkness. "This way, follow me." It was Sarah. She was hiding behind a thick oak tree, her face a pale mask of terror. She held a small, rusted axe in her hand. I found it," she whispered. "It was in a small lean-to. I don't know why, but I took it." Elias didn't question her. He followed her, his body aching, his lungs burning. She led him through a dense thicket of thorns and into a small open clearing. There was a small rusted shed in the middle of the clearing. It was not the shed from the inn. It was a smaller, more dilapidated one. He has another place," Sarah whispered, her voice shaking. "A place where he keeps other things. I saw him go there once. At night." Elias looked at the shed. A small, almost imperceptible sliver of light emanated from the cracks in the walls. Finch was inside. He was not chasing them. He was here. He was waiting for them. Elias looked at Sarah, then at the axe in her hand. A terrible, horrifying realization dawned on him. Finch hadn't been chasing them. He had been leading them. He wanted them to come here, to his other lair. He was a master of psychological games, a monster who delighted in the terror of his victims. He wanted them to feel hopeless, to feel trapped, to feel the cold hand of despair. Elias knew he couldn't leave. He couldn't let Finch get away with this. He had to find a way to get into that shed, to find the evidence to expose him. He looked at Sarah. "Do you still have the axe?" She nodded, her eyes wide with a mixture of terror and resolve. "Good," Elias said, his voice a low whisper. "We're going in." The shed was a small, dilapidated structure, its weathered timber sagging under the weight of time and neglect. A faint, sweetish odor of decay, a smell Elias now associated with Alistair Finch's gruesome work, hung in the air. Elias and Sarah stood at the edge of the clearing, their hearts pounding in a synchronized rhythm of fear and defiance. "Are you sure about this?" Sarah whispered, her voice trembling. "We have to," Elias said, his gaze fixed on the sliver of light from the shed. "If we don't, no one will ever know. No one will ever find them." He took a deep breath and moved toward the shed, Sarah close behind him. He crept to the side of the building and peered through a crack in the wood. The sight that met his eyes was a grotesque tableau. The shed was not a storage space. It was a workshop of horrors. Alistair Finch was inside, his gaunt figure silhouetted against the light of a single lantern. He was seated at a small wooden table, his large hands meticulously working on a grim task. Before him lay a collection of objects, arranged with a chilling, almost artistic precision. They were hands, dozens of them pale and lifeless, preserved in jars of a clear, oily substance. Some were missing fingers, some were whole, and some were dismembered. Elias felt the bile rise in his throat. He had a strong stomach, but this was beyond anything he had ever witnessed. Finch was a collector, a connoisseur of human remains. Finch picked up a small hand, its fingers slender and delicate. He held it up to the light, a look of serene contentment on his face. He then placed it in a jar, its fingers curled into a grotesque, claw-like shape. Elias felt a cold rage bubbling in his stomach, a righteous fury that overpowered his fear. He had to stop this man. He had to expose him. He had to make sure he paid for his crimes. He looked at Sarah. Her face was a mask of horror. She was paralyzed, unable to move, to speak. "We have to go back to the town," Elias whispered, his voice a low, urgent murmur. "We have to get help. We have to tell the constable." Sarah didn't respond. She just stood there, her eyes wide and vacant, as if she were in a trance. Elias grabbed her arm and pulled her away from the shed. They stumbled back into the woods, their escape from Finch's sick ritual a desperate, clumsy flight. They ran until their lungs ached, until the cold, desolate landscape of the woods gave way to the faint, distant lights of the town. It was a long, brutal journey, but they made it. They had survived Finch's game, at least for now. The town of Ashford was a small, sleepy place, its streets lit by a few gas lamps. The houses were dark, their occupants long since asleep. Elias and Sarah ran to the constable's office, a small two-story building on the edge of town. They pounded on the door, their frantic knocks echoing in the silent street. The constable, a large, burly man with a weathered face named Silas, opened the door. He looked at them, his eyes narrowed with suspicion. "What's all this ruckus?" Elias, breathless and exhausted, began to explain. He told him about Alistair Finch, the Ashwood Inn, the ledger, the handkerchief, the hands, the horrifying workshop. He spoke with a feverish intensity, his words a desperate cascade of truth. Silas listened, his face impassive. He looked from Elias to Sarah, then back to Elias. "A macabre tale, son, but without proof it's just a story." "I have proof," Elias said, his voice cracking. He reached into his breast pocket and pulled out the blood-stained handkerchief. He laid it on the constable's desk. "And I have the ledger, the names of his victims. He keeps it at the inn." Silas picked up the handkerchief, his eyes scrutinizing the small, dark stain. "This could be anything," he said, his voice flat. "And a ledger? It's just a book, son. A madman's delusions don't make for a crime." Elias's hope began to crumble. No one would believe him. He was just a traveling journalist, a stranger with a wild story. Silas was a man of logic, of proof, of facts. And Elias had nothing but a blood-stained cloth and a wild, terrifying tale. "He's a murderer!" Sarah cried out, her voice filled with a desperate, gut-wrenching plea. "He's a monster! He's a collector of human hands!" Silas looked at her, then back at Elias. He sighed, a tired, weary sound. "I'll ride out with you in the morning," he said. "We'll take a look, but don't expect to find anything. The kind of man you're talking about, they don't leave things lying around." Elias knew he was right. Finch was a master of his craft, a man who reveled in the chaos he created, a man who would never leave a trace. He would have known they had escaped. He would have been watching them, and he would have cleaned up his act. Elias looked at Sarah. Her eyes were wide, filled with a hopelessness that was more terrifying than any monster. She had seen the truth, she had lived it, but no one would believe her. They were alone. They were just two people against a monster who was always one step ahead. Stay tuned for the next chapter. If you're enjoying this story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more spine-chilling tales. The journey back to the Ashwood Inn was a silent, somber affair. The morning light, pale and weak, cast long shadows across the snow-covered landscape. Constable Silas rode ahead on his horse, his face a mask of skepticism. Elias and Sarah followed in a small, rented carriage, the silence between them heavy with a sense of dread. Elias knew that Silas wouldn't find anything. Finch was too smart, too careful. He was a predator who left no trace. When they arrived at the inn, the sight that greeted them was unnervingly normal. The sign, "The Ashwood Inn, Mr. Alistair Finch, proprietor," creaked in the gentle morning breeze. The windows, which had looked like vacant eyes just a day ago, now seemed to stare out with a serene, almost innocent calm. The scent of a warm fire and freshly baked bread wafted from inside. It was a perfect, charming facade, a cruel mockery of the horror that lay within. Alistair Finch stood at the counter, a polite smile on his face as if nothing had happened. He looked at Elias with an almost amused glint in his eyes. "Mr. Thorne, back so soon? I trust you found your belongings." Elias's blood ran cold. He knew Finch was toying with him. He had found his satchel, his belongings, his evidence. He had been there in his room, going through his things, and now he was playing a sick game. Constable Silas dismounted, his boots crunching on the gravel. "Mr. Finch, I have a few questions for you." Finch's smile didn't falter. "Of course, Constable. Anything to help." He looked at Sarah, a brief, chilling flicker of recognition in his eyes before his gaze settled on Elias. "I trust Mr. Thorne has been entertaining you with his stories." Silas ignored the insinuation. "I have a report of missing persons from this inn, a number of women to be exact." "Missing?" Finch feigned surprise, his eyebrows raised in a look of innocent bewilderment. "Why, I wouldn't know anything about that. My guests come and go. I don't keep track of their whereabouts once they've left." Silas, his skepticism growing, gestured to the ledger on the counter. "What about this? It lists a number of female guests." "Indeed," Finch said, his voice calm. "My guests are primarily female. They are traveling merchants, seamstresses and the like. It's a busy road, Constable. Women need a place to rest." Silas looked at the ledger, then at Finch. He saw nothing but a polite, if a little eccentric, innkeeper. He turned to Elias. "Where's this evidence you spoke of?" Elias's stomach clenched. He knew the answer. He took it. He knew we were coming." Silas sighed, a heavy, exasperated sound. "Mr. Finch, I'm afraid I'll have to search your premises. Do you have any objections?" "None at all," Finch said, a triumphant smile now playing on his lips. "Feel free to look around. I have nothing to hide." The search was a farce. Silas looked everywhere, in the kitchen, the rooms, the cellar. He found nothing. No hands, no bloodstains, no signs of a struggle. The inn was spotless, pristine, a perfect facade of normalcy. He even went to the shed, the one where Elias had seen the human hands. It was empty. The jars were gone. The table was gone. The only thing left was the faint, sweetish odor of decay, a smell that only Elias and Sarah could detect. Silas, his frustration mounting, turned to Finch. "Is there another shed? A second one? A second shed?" Finch feigned confusion. "Why no, Constable. I have only one. What would I need 2 sheds for?" Elias knew then. Finch had a secret accomplice. Someone who had cleaned up the shed in the woods. Someone who was helping him. But who? Suddenly a voice, a small, frightened whisper, came from behind the counter. It was the serving girl, Sarah. She had been hiding, a silent, unseen witness. She pointed a trembling finger at Alistair Finch. "He's a liar. He took their hands. He has a secret room in the basement." Finch's face, which had been a mask of calm, contorted into a look of pure rage. He lunged at her, his hands outstretched. "Liar," he snarled. "Filthy lying girl." Silas, with the quick reflexes of a man who had seen a lifetime of violence, tackled Finch, pinning him to the ground. "Hold it, Finch. That's enough." Elias looked at Sarah. Her eyes were filled with a desperate plea. She knew something. She knew where the evidence was. "Where is it, Sarah?" Elias asked, his voice low and urgent. "Tell me, where is the secret room?" The fireplace," she stammered, pointing a trembling finger at the large stone hearth in the corner of the room. "The stone, the one with the strange marking. It's a secret lever." Elias ran to the fireplace. He looked at the stones, his hands fumbling for the one with the strange marking. He found it, a small, almost invisible carving of a human hand. He pressed it. Nothing happened. He pressed again, harder this time. With a low, grinding sound, a large stone in the corner of the hearth shifted, revealing a dark, gaping hole. The air from the hole was cold and stale, carrying with it a powerful odor of damp earth and decay. Elias and Silas, their lanterns held aloft, descended the narrow stone steps. The light from their lanterns revealed a small, dark room. It was not a torture chamber, not a gruesome workshop. It was a museum. On the walls, in glass cases, were dozens of small human hands. They were arranged in rows like butterflies in a collector's cabinet. They were pale and lifeless, their fingers bent and twisted into grotesque, unnatural shapes. Each hand was labeled with a small, neat tag. The names of the women: Eleanor, Genevieve, Rose, Clara, and the date of their death. Silas gasped, his face a mask of utter horror. "My God," he whispered. "He's a monster." Elias looked at the hands, the silent, accusing ghosts of Finch's victims. He had found the truth. He had found the proof. But as he stood there, a strange, unsettling feeling washed over him. The hands were not just lifeless objects. They were alive. He could almost feel them, a cold, clammy presence in the room. He could hear them, a silent, accusing whisper. He had exposed a monster, but the horror was just beginning. The discovery of the Macabre museum in the inn cellar was a moment of horrifying clarity. Constable Silas, a man of facts and reason, stood in a state of shock, his lantern trembling in his hand. The reality of Alistair Finch's depravity was laid out before them in a tableau of grotesque beauty. The collected hands were not just evidence, they were a monument to a twisted obsession, a museum of human suffering. Finch, who had been struggling against Silas's grip, now stood still, a look of serene contentment on his face. He watched as they stared at his collection, his dark eyes gleaming with a sick sense of pride. "A work of art, isn't it?" he purred. "I call it the Gallery of Lost Fortunes. Each hand tells a story, a tale of a woman who came to me seeking a new life, only to find a new purpose." Elias felt a cold dread settle in his stomach. Finch wasn't just a murderer, he was a philosophical sadist, a man who saw his victims as a means to a grand, horrific art form. He was a collector of lives, a connoisseur of death. Silas, his shock giving way to a cold, hard rage, dragged Finch out of the cellar and into the custody of the deputies who had now arrived. The town, which had been silent and sleepy just moments before, was now alive with a frantic energy. People gathered, their faces a mixture of morbid curiosity and utter horror. Elias, exhausted and emotionally drained, sat on a bench outside the inn, watching as Finch was led away in chains. He had done it. He had exposed the monster. He had brought the truth to light. But the victory felt hollow. He had seen too much. The images of the hands, the silent, accusing whispers of the dead, were seared into his memory. Sarah came and sat beside him. Her face was pale, but her eyes held a newfound strength. "We did it," she whispered. "We exposed him. He can't hurt anyone else." Elias nodded, but his mind was still in the cellar, in the Museum of Horrors. "Why hands?" he asked, his voice a low, hollow sound. "Why not just take their money and let them go?" "You don't understand," Sarah said, her voice a low murmur. "It's not about money, it's about power. It's about control. He took their identity, their purpose, their life. He made them into his art." She shivered. "He told me once. He said that when a woman has a lot of fortune, she carries it in her hands. He said he was just collecting it." Elias looked at the inn, a place that now seemed to radiate a cold, malevolent energy. He had survived. He had escaped. But the experience had changed him forever. The cynical, world-weary journalist was now a haunted, broken man. He had seen the darkest corners of the human soul, and he knew that there were monsters hiding in plain sight, monsters who wore the face of a polite innkeeper. The next day, the town of Ashford was a flurry of activity. The news of Finch's crimes spread like wildfire, carried by the traveling merchants and the gossiping townsfolk. Elias's story, the one he had come here to write, was no longer a simple account of a rural community. It was a harrowing, terrifying tale of a macabre case, a psychological horror that would haunt the town and Elias for the rest of their lives. Elias stayed in Ashford for another week, helping the constable with the investigation, giving his testimony. The hands were carefully removed from the cellar and given a proper burial. The inn, once a symbol of twisted hospitality, was now a place of grim legend, a monument to the evil that could exist behind a smiling face. Elias, his mission complete, packed his satchel. He was ready to leave, to go back to Boston, to write his story. He would be famous. He would be the journalist who exposed the monster of Ashford. But the fame, he knew, would come with a heavy price. He would never be the same. The cynical, detached journalist was gone, replaced by a man who had seen too much, a man who would forever be looking over his shoulder. He looked at Sarah, who was now preparing to leave as well. She was going to Boston to start a new life, a life free from the shadows of the inn. "What will you do?" he asked her. "I will live," she said, her voice filled with a quiet resolve. "I will live for them. I will honor their memory, and I will never, ever be afraid again." Elias smiled, a genuine, heartfelt smile. She had found her strength, her purpose in the face of unspeakable horror. He had found his. He was no longer just a journalist. He was a witness, a chronicler of a dark, forgotten chapter of human history. He walked out of the inn and into the cold, a solitary figure against the vast, empty landscape. He had exposed a monster, but he knew, with a terrifying certainty, that there were others out there, hiding in the shadows, waiting. He had a story to tell, a story that would warn the world. But as he walked away, he heard a sound, a faint, chilling whisper on the wind, a sound that seemed to come from the very earth itself. It was the sound of a human hand, beckoning him, inviting him into a world of endless, unspeakable horror. Elias Thorne's article, "The Ashford Inn, a Macabre Case of a Collector of Hands," was a sensation. It was published in the Boston Sentinel and quickly picked up by newspapers across the country. The story of Alistair Finch, the unassuming innkeeper who collected human hands as a grotesque work of art, sent a collective shudder through a nation that was still grappling with its own internal conflicts. The people of America, used to tales of war and political intrigue, were now confronted with a horror that was deeply personal and profoundly unsettling. Elias was hailed as a hero, a courageous journalist who had stared into the abyss and lived to tell the tale. But the fame, as he had suspected, came with a heavy price. The public saw him as a hero, but he saw himself as a haunted man. He was no longer just a writer of words. He was a living archive of a nightmare. The images of the hands in the cellar, the silent, accusing eyes of the dead, the chilling smile of Alistair Finch, they were all seared into his memory, a permanent scar on his soul. He had traded his cynical detachment for a constant, gnawing anxiety, a perpetual state of looking over his shoulder. He tried to go back to his old life, to his old work. He took on new assignments, new stories, but he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. Every time he passed an inn, a chill would run down his spine. Every time he shook a stranger's hand, he would feel a cold dread, an unspoken question. Was this a new collector? Was this another Finch? The nightmares were the worst. He would dream of the cellar, the small, dark room filled with glass cases. But in his dreams, the hands were not lifeless objects. They were alive, their fingers twitching, their palms reaching out to him, a silent, ghoulish invitation. He would wake up in a cold sweat, his heart pounding, his body trembling with a fear that was more real than any physical threat. He tried to find solace in his friendship with Sarah, who had also found her way to Boston. She had found a job as a seamstress, and she was, as she had promised, living her life. But she was not the same either. The girl with the wide, frightened eyes was now a woman with a quiet strength, a woman who carried the weight of her past with a stoic grace. They would meet for coffee, their conversations a silent understanding of shared trauma. They had both survived, but they were both forever changed. One day, he received a letter. The handwriting was familiar, elegant and sloping. It was from Alistair Finch. It had been sent from his prison cell. Elias, his hands shaking, opened the letter. "My dear Mr. Thorne," it read, "I trust you are enjoying your newfound fame. You have a keen eye, a good mind. You were a worthy adversary. But you have only seen the surface of my work. You see, I was not the only collector. I was just the most successful one. We are everywhere. We are in every town, in every city. We are the silent artisans, the collectors of lost fortunes. We are a community, a fellowship. We will be watching you, Mr. Thorne. Always. Elias felt a cold, paralyzing terror wash over him. The letter was not a threat. It was a promise. Finch had not been a lone monster. He had been a part of something bigger, something more sinister. A hidden society of killers, a brotherhood of collectors. He showed the letter to Silas, who was in Boston on a visit. Silas read it, his face grim. "He's just trying to scare you, son. It's a madman's delusions. Don't believe a word of it." But Elias knew it was true. He had seen the way Finch had smiled, the way he had reveled in his art. He was a man who lived by a twisted philosophy, a man who saw his crimes as a higher purpose. He was not alone. Elias tore up the letter, but the words were already etched into his memory. He tried to forget, to move on, but he couldn't. He had exposed a monster, but he had also become a part of the horror. He had been a witness, a chronicler, but he was also a target. He had a story to tell, a story that would warn the world. But he knew, with a terrifying certainty, that the story was not over. It had just begun. He would spend the rest of his life looking over his shoulder, a man haunted by the ghosts of a museum he had helped create. He was a hero to the world, but to himself, he was just another victim.